Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be back here at World Policy Conference to share with you our perspective on the BRICS expansion, and its impact on the world order. I'm being joined by an outstanding panel, which I'll be introducing in detail in a few minutes, after having had the possibility to frame the discussion we will have over the next hour. We want to talk about the implications of the BRICS expansion for the future global order. And the question is BRICS a new reality? Is it a myth? How will it impact businesses around the world? Well, for those people who were doubting about the impact of BRICS, I think this picture says it all. The BRICS meeting 6 weeks ago in Kazan, bringing together the 5 original BRICS countries, plus the 4 new additions, showing the world that in 2024, 9 leading economies of the world meet in Russia and define the future of their economies, potentially together. When we talk to CEOs, executive committees, and boards around the world, many topics are on the corporate agenda, and especially the impact that they have on the development of economies. There is the shift of trade to Asia. There's the question around China deceleration. There is the impact of the ultimate election year, given that 2024 was the year where 73 countries had elections. There's a question around the impact of conflicts in the Middle East, of conflicts in Ukraine on business. There is, of course, the whole question around the geopolitics of AI and the control of countries over AI. There is the rise of green industrial policies. Of course, the challenges of a demographic devolution and fast aging societies. And there is the competition for talent, where, by the way, our host country is very successful in attracting and retaining top talent. But you see also one of these 9 forces that are shaping global business landscape is the BRICS expansion. And that's the reason why we want to talk about this today. Well, if you look at the overall geopolitics and the overall geopolitics of global alliances, you see that BRICS is actually a very interesting addition to the big global alliances in the world. And it is actually an interesting counterpart to G7. If you look at the huge amount of population, the impact on GDP, and also trade, BRICS is an important entity going forward, which is, of course, also straddling the G20 world. Now, the 9 official BRICS countries, and we all know that the position of Saudi Arabia is still open after its invitation, has an impact on different areas. BRICS will have impact on, from our side, 5 areas. 5 areas that are critical for corporations. First, energy. Second, trade. Third, infrastructure and development. Fourth, the monetary policy. And last but not least, the technological cooperation. So let me deep dive on 2 of these 5 areas. The first one is energy. If you look at the volume of oil and gas that the BRICS, the expanded BRICS, plus Saudi Arabia, plus the countries that would like to join the BRICS control, we see that this group is controlling the large majority of the world's oil and a good portion of the world's gas production. What is also interesting is when you look at where do the BRICS countries get their energy from, you see on the right-hand side of this chart that the large majority is actually an intra-BRIC trade of energy. So what this chart shows you is that actually the BRICS, the expanded BRICS, and potential new countries joining the BRICS are creating an own sphere of energy market, independent of other players. So that's one deep dive I wanted to share with you. The second deep dive I wanted to share with you is trade. This picture shows on the left-hand side the export, on the right-hand side the import. And it shows how many percentage of the exports of these 9 countries go to their fellow BRICS countries. And on the right-hand side, it shows you how much of the imports is coming from the fellow BRICS countries. And this is a picture that compares 2003 to 2023. And you see that in 20 years difference, for many countries, the share of intra-BRICS trade has grown between 10 to 20 percentage points. So again, an element where we personally think that it is important for corporations to understand the impact that BRICS will have on their trading patterns. Let me conclude with the last slide to frame our discussions. And we were asked here to have a business perspective. So we see that there are implications for companies in this new BRICS world. And I think it's actually implications for companies that are BRICS-based, but also companies that are non-BRICS-based. And it starts with the fact of developing a BRICS-specific go-to-market strategy. How do you approach these countries? I think we've seen it here, and we see it here around. BRICS is a concentration of countries with massive infrastructure investments. And the question is, how can you tap into the infrastructure boom in these markets? It is also important in a world where we have learned that pandemic, war, and tariff can disrupt overnight trade lanes. BRICS can be a formidable base for resilient supply chains. But, and I think I showed it with my first picture of the summit in Kazan, it's also necessary to navigate the BRICS in the overall environment of also Western sanctions regimes. And last but not least, to be successful in these countries, companies need to develop what we call the geopolitical muscle, i.e. the ability of companies to understand geopolitical shifts, trade developments, and of course also to be able to integrate that in their decision-making, be it for investments or long-term strategies. So with that framing, I'm very happy to join our panel, which I'm introducing now in detail, for a discussion. And we have, I think, a very nice representation here from the BRICS countries, except one country. And the funny thing is, I don't know if we always were joking, Étienne, in the green room, because it's rare that we have 2 Austrians on a panel of 5, so a little neutral country in the middle of Europe. But I'd like to introduce the panel, and so I start with His Excellency Étienne Berchtold, the Ambassador of the Republic of Austria here in the UAE. You have been here for 2 years. We just talked about the fascinating dynamic of this region, and before that you have been working at the Chancellery in Vienna. You've been the spokesperson to 3 Austrian Chancellors, and I think you have a very broad and comprehensive perspective of the world, so thank you for joining us today. Then I'm happy to introduce Trudi. Trudi Makhaya from South Africa, so the S in the Brics, if I may say so. You have been the Special Economic Advisor to President Ramaphosa from 2018 to 2023. You're now on the board of the Spar group. I think you have, and we'll talk about later, a very interesting perspective on the Brics from a South African point of view. And of course, I think we look forward to seeing also how you see maybe also other African countries who are joining the Brics. Then starting with the first letter in the Brics, from Brazil, Constanza, Negri, Biasutti. Constanza, you have been the B20 Sherpa for Brazil, and you're actually heading the trade and international integration of the Federal Association of Brazilian Industry, CNI. And we have been talking already in the preparation about what is actually Brazil's perspective on B20, G20 Brics. And we had this chart before where we saw the different overlaps and non-overlaps. So that plays an important role. And then from China, Yide, you are the Vice Chairman and Secretary General of the Shanghai Development Research Foundation. You have a long history of research on development, on the impact of development in countries, both in the US and in China. And we're very grateful that you made the long trip to join us here as WPC to share that perspective. So let me start with you, Étienne, and a first perspective when we look at the Brics, and especially, I would say, the development of the Brics. You saw this chart which I had laid out with G20, with G7, with the EU. From your perspective, what does this development of the Brics has as an impact for other international institutions, for other countries? Looking at it deliberately first from the outside on.
So, Nikolaus, thank you very much for the introduction and this very prevalent question. Permettez-moi aussi vous adresser en français pour remercier, pour pouvoir adresser cette conférence aujourd'hui. I continue now in English, of course, as this is only English. Quite arguably, yes, we have seen a decrease in Western influence, a steady decrease over the last 15 years. In fact, if you look at it, started all with Lehman Brothers, and since then we see a bit of a decline in the relevance of, and if we are honest, we have to admit it, of G7, G20 has been on the rise a bit, European Union a bit less influential. Where can we track that down? Where can we see this impact? We have to be very open and frank with ourselves. We were under different assumptions when we imposed the sanctions against Russia in 2022. It was a very clear understanding that within a few months the Russian economy would be in shatters. It is not. So is it a failure? No. Was it a mistake? No. It was necessary to impose the sanctions on Russia after its war of aggression against Ukraine. There was no alternative from a standpoint of international law. You cannot just stand by and do nothing. But what was the expectation? It was that Russia would more or less be on its knees within a few months because the rest of the world would follow us in imposing sanctions because they could not afford not to impose sanctions. But quite honestly, half of the world has not followed us on this path of imposing sanctions. So this leads us to an evaluation of where we stand and where we should continue going. And one of the main lessons to be drawn for the West, for the G7, for the European Union is not to continue to lament this decline in influence, which also is a bit something that we have to blame on ourselves. We have a lackluster economic performance. We have political domestic crisis in many European countries, difficulties in forming governments, not only in France, also in my country. It takes some time. So it is not unsurmountable. These are challenges. This is normal. But of course, this leads to a decline in influence and the perception in other parts of the world that, yes, in fact, they are less influential, less important. So, and as your charts have shown, there have been shifts in shares of GDP in the population they represent, 45% the Brics, in the raw earths that are to be found in in BRICS countries. Brazil has pointed it out at its speech, the Kazan summit, that quite arguably a large percentage of the rare minerals and earths are to be found in BRICS countries, important for the energy transition. So what do we do now? We must engage in a dialogue with BRICS countries and not lecture them. And we should listen to them and their concerns. If, for example, our host country tells us, listen, the BRICS for us is a geo-economic project, we should accept it as such and start a dialogue on the basis of this being a geo-economic project meant at economic diversification. And the UAE is very good at economic diversification and at implementing CPAs, their free trade agreements. They want to do some with the European Union as well. So maybe we should also take the hand that is extended to us as a European Union and agree on starting negotiations also with the UAE on a CEPA. That would help, for example, to engage bilaterally. What would also help is to invite BRICS leaders, as has been done this year already by Italy, to G7 summits. Like if you give them also a place at the big seats, this will help by also listening to what they have to say, and it would be easier to get them on board because they are already, with the exception, of course, of Russia, on a dialogue on sanctions against Russia, on dual-use items, on how to bring about peace. So that should be something that we should really focus on as well in the future. And this leads us to the other point that at the end of the day, yes, we have seen a decline in our influence, but that's not irreversible. We can also read the Draghi report, read many other reports that are out about how to increase, and this is something you are an expert on, how to increase competitiveness, how to tap into the potential of AI. We as Europe, we are nowhere to be seen on AI. We have no AI champions. They are to be found in Asia and in the US, not in Europe. That is a problem. We can solve that. We can do that. If we are successful in that, we will be of more relevance and more importance. The UE is seeking an alliance with the US on AI, not so much with Europe. There is a reason for that. And at the end, we should be a bit careful with threats issued against the BRICS, as President-elect Trump has made clear a week ago on Twitter or on X, that if ever they should implement an alternative to the dollar, there will be 100% tariffs. So far, there haven't been any concrete plans to implement a currency on the BRICS level. But if we continue to threaten them, maybe we will give them the idea that they should do that and even trade more among the BRICS, as we have outlined, and create their own financial system to immunize themselves from sanctions. Yes. So we should be careful that it doesn't backfire, and that will stop here. Yeah.
No, but I think it's very interesting what you say in terms of having this dialogue with the BRICS countries. I think, you mentioned the 100% tariff threat, which I think was, again, part of a tactical policy, but I think it's definitely not an example of a dialogue. I think the question of how to join forces with the BRICS countries plays an important role. Thank you for your first intervention. So Trudi, over to you. So what does BRIC mean for Africa? And from your experience also in South Africa, what are the benefits countries can take from there? What do you see as key contributions going forward?
Thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think looking at it from a South African and African perspective, our economies have integrated into the world economy in difficult and sometimes complicated ways. I mean, Africa has been a marginalized continent in terms of contribution to trade, in terms of investment flows. And so I think when BRICS came along, it promised the possibility of having a different kind of global economic cooperation that didn't have the legacy of the historical relationship that African economies have had with the global economy typically. I mean, I think we all know the history in terms of being a continent that has been extracted from, a continent that is dependent in many ways on the global economy, and a continent that also had very difficult relationships with Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, IMF. If you think back to the 80s, a lot of the debates around structural adjustment, a lot of the debates about the world dictating to African economies economic policy without fully understanding African realities. So I think the idea of an alternative to that and a different way of trading and investment has been very attractive. Of course, South Africa was the first country that benefited from Brics expansion in terms of being invited to join the bloc a year after BRIC formed to become Brics. And at the time, so quite soon after the global financial crisis, it also promised a way to recover with a different set of economies. I think if we look at the experience since then in terms of that promise, the Brics has grown to be quite sophisticated. You see it in their communiques, lots of ambition around trading amongst each other, investing in each other's economies. Now, if I become very specific to the South African experience, if we look at the trade perspective, we export mostly, in the Brics configuration, mostly to China, but also to a certain extent we enjoy good relations with Brazil, India, less so in terms of exports and trade with Russia, but still quite present. And we find that the trade balance on the whole has been against South Africa, so we're running a deficit against the Brics nations, in particular the main trading partner there being China. And we also find that a lot of the exports that we send to the Brics bloc remain commodities with very low value added, and they also tend to have very cyclical price cycles. So then the question becomes, have we really changed the quality fundamentally of the trade? So you'd have seen in recent times a lot of the advocacy from South Africa to the Brics nations has been, how do we close the trade gap and try to move towards a more balanced trade to narrow the deficit in essence? And also, how do we move away from commodities to more value-added products? So in a sense, I can say that in terms of providing options, the Brics has been very important. But when it comes to some of the fundamental structural changes that we want to see in the way Africa engages with the rest of the world, that is still very much a work in progress. If I think of it from then a foreign direct investment perspective, we've seen South African companies invest in the rest of the Brics, notable investments, for instance, Naspers, one of the major media conglomerates coming out of South Africa, is well invested in Brazil, in Russia, Discovery Holdings in China. You know, one could go on with a few, and vice versa. And with the prospect of Brics expansion, we see countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, being quite active also in terms of inward investment into South Africa and into the continent. So you talked about energy earlier, which is quite interesting in terms of oil and gas. But if you look at South Africa in terms of renewable energy, the biggest renewable energy investment in South Africa is actually from Aqua Power, Saudi headquartered, a 100 megawatt plant. So there are also those new energy partnerships that are forming that promise to create a sense of cohesion and independence within the bloc. From a development finance perspective, if we think about the new development bank and what it means for infrastructure, or the Brics Bank as it's often called, it has really been one of the successes of the Brics in terms of creating a new institution from scratch, and an institution that can hold its own, much smaller still than the World Bank, but can hold its own in terms of advancing loans to African countries and other countries for infrastructure. So if I had to summarize, I would say Brics is giving options. Expansion is deepening those options, but it's important that this is constructive optionality that really changes the structure of how Africa is integrated into the rest of the economy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Trudi. And I think this perspective of optionality, I think, plays an important role, not only for South Africa, but also for Brazil. And Constanza, Brazil is in a very interesting position. You have had G20 now, just in Rio in November. You'll have the presidency of Brics next year. So you representing the Brazilian companies and corporate world, how do these companies actually make the best out of these two worlds? You're one of the few countries that are actually in both groups, and what can the private sector take from this?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join for the first time the World Policy Conference, which is extremely interesting. And thank you for the opportunity to bring the private sector perspective and the southern perspective. As you said, I think Brazil places the two presidency of this forum, and if we add COP30, place the country in a key position to shape global discussions and to foster cooperation, which is badly needed in these times. And I think that before going into the contents and the synergies that you mentioned, some general comments from the Brazilian perspective. So despite the differences that we see in terms of composition, geopolitical views of these two groups, G20 and Brics, they should be seen as complementary, as Trudi was saying. And this is particularly more true for Brazil, a country which pursues equidistance in terms of foreign policy. And at these times, by balancing relationship with different powers, Brazil creates more strategic opportunities for the private sectors and to diversify economic opportunities. So I think that while the economic integration across these forums, specifically in terms of the BRIC, may take some time, and if we'll have to see, and the expanded BRICS are still in a very early stage to know what will happen, as my colleague from the US Chamber was saying yesterday, I think it reflects that they already represent important market for businesses in the short term. So the active participation in the discussions in these forums is strategically and is badly needed in terms of the private sector agenda for the economic agenda to move. If we see from the government perspective, just quickly to remind, what are the main priorities that Brazil has established for these two presidencies? For the G20, fight hunger, poverty, inequality, address sustainable development across economic, social, and environmental dimensions, and advance global governance reform to reflect contemporary realities. If we look into the BRICS priorities, which the Brazilian government has already given a quick overview, and there will be detail along next year, since it starts in January of 2025, we see 5 priorities in terms of the government. Reform of international monetary and financial systems, artificial intelligence governance, climate change, about coordinating efforts for COP30 and other issues that are unaddressed topics in the UNFCCC framework. Health, it will be one of the priorities in BRICS for Brazil, and the institutional development inside the governance of the BRICS in terms of how to integrate new BRICS members and streamline the coordination mechanism. We, from the private sector, in terms of the National Confederation of Industry, will have a big responsibility in chairing, where are the groups of the private sector that channel the inputs into the B20 and into the BRICS. With the B20, we finish our work, and we already handed over to our colleagues of South Africa, but we already start working on what will be the priorities for the Brazilian private sector for the BRICS to contribute. And so I would like to share probably 5 non-exhaustive priorities that we see looking into the synergy of these two groups. The first one is related to what Étienne was mentioning, financing sustainable infrastructure and energy transition. As we know, climate action requires a bold private-public collaboration and to close the finance gap and to scale net zero solutions and a fair energy transition. So here the priority that we see is how to accelerate as a complement to the public funds, private capital. How do we unlock private sector investment? And how do we refine the regulatory policies that can leverage private finance for the climate, for the energy transition? Also here, the new development bank, as it was mentioned, has a key role to play in this area. And I think there's also an important element linked to infrastructure. How do we increase the pipeline of approved fundable projects for infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure? Our second priority, it was very much linked to what you were mentioning, Nikolaus, fostering trade and global value chains. And you already put it very well. International trade and investment are critical drivers for economic development and technological progress of companies. But we know that trade growth has slowed over the past 5 years. So here the priorities that we do see for the Brics is how do we enhance trade governance? How do we advance digitalization process of trade to reduce cost and time and cost? And also one more innovative element that we see for that agenda is how do we promote regulatory practice and interoperable taxonomies for environmental sustainability? For instance, how do we work on internationally accepted methodologies for carbon footprints, which is extremely relevant for companies? The third priority is linked to global governance of artificial intelligence. As we know, artificial intelligence has emerged as one of the most transformative technologies of this century, with global investment projected to surpass 630 billion by 2028. But it also has poses a lot of challenges. So here the priorities that we are establishing is how do we unlock the artificial intelligence potential responsibly, fostering innovation and ensuring that it benefits as shared and equitable across societies. And three main aspects are related to this priority. Global convergence. We need to foster international collaboration with harmonized terminologies and risk-based governance frameworks. Currently, this is one of the main areas in which Brazil is moving ahead in terms of the regulatory aspects. Pro-innovation regulations. How do we scale up frameworks that support responsible AI? And last but not least, what is about ethical implementation of AI? How do we promote unbiased AI through the public-private coalitions? And another priority that we see connected very much with the artificial intelligence is about building a resilient and productive workforce, the other side of the coin. How do we, the future of work is being reshaped, as we know, by environmental, technological, and economic trends. So we need to think about priorities to expand digital education. How do we address these skill gaps connected with reskilling, upskilling, and how do we modernize the curriculum to align with artificial intelligence and technological advancement of the workforce? And last but not least, another priority that we're putting in terms of the Brics agenda, and then you also work on the B20, is sustainable food system and agriculture, especially for Brazil. Agriculture faces challenges that are related to climate change, food insecurity, greenhouse gas emissions. So here the idea is how do we put priorities, policy priorities in the groups and agenda that foster sustainable productivity growth through biotechnologies and digital agriculture, while we strengthen at the same time a priority that is connected with trade, the multilateral trade system. How do we eliminate trade barriers, which are extremely important to addressing the food security agenda? So quite in a nutshell, those are the main 5 areas that we're going to work in the Brics Business Council next year. And of course, this will be discussed with the several private sector from all the countries, the expanded countries, and we hope to make consensus along those lines. Thank you very much.
Great, Constanza. Thank you very much. I think it's fascinating to see that what sometimes some people see as antagonistic organizations or groupings are actually quite complementary when you see it from a Brazilian perspective or from the private sector perspective. So really interesting, and also all the best for next year. I think having G20 and Brics within 12 months is quite an achievement. So, Qiao Yide, thank you for joining us. We have already heard, I think both Trudi and Constanza alluded to the NDP, the New Development Bank. Some people call it the Brics Bank. So from your unique also research vantage point, how do you see NDB in this new development? What will be its impact and its future role?
Okay. Let me start with very briefly introduce the general picture of the NDB. It was established 10 years ago. headquarters in Shanghai, my hometown. It was located in very nice modern building, which was donated by Shanghai municipal government. Its required equity is 100 billion US dollar, while initial capital is 50 billion US dollars. By the end of November last year, they approved the loan more than 35 billion US dollars. Among them, 7.2 billion in their own currencies. Total together, the project is almost 100 projects approved. These investments focus in clean energy, transportation infrastructure, water and health facilities, environment protection. The president, the NDB, very interesting, is taken in rotation as an order with first India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and China. Oh, by the way, the equity is equally among 5 initial members. So the interesting why India is the first one, why China is the last one. I was taught because headquarters located in China, so China have to put the last one to become the president. Currently, the president of New Development Bank is former Brazil President, Ms. Biasutti. Its end of its tenure should be end of next year. The interestingly, next term is Russia. I was taught, finally, Russia made a decision. They let Ms. Biasutti do one more tenure in order to avoid the awkward situation for NDB. That's very interesting and unusual. In summary, I want to point out some points. First of all, NDB is operating very well. The SP, Standard & Poor's, rating NDB as a AA+, which is higher than that on individual country among 5 countries. That's higher than that. The cost they are raising capital in the international market, the cost only 30 or 40 BP than that World Bank. World Bank get the lowest cost in the capital market. The NDB just pay a little bit high than World Bank. That's first point. Second point is very obviously the principle and the spirit of equity has been well carried out because, as I mentioned, the equity is equitable share among the 5 initial members. Also, as I mentioned, they have some compromise in many ways. The last point, I guess, the fact, the history, the performance verify its purpose and the target are to support the existing international economic order rather than undercut or undercut it as someone originally suspected. So I guess that's my summary for NDB.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good. No, so we have about 20 minutes left, and we also want to get some questions from the audience, but I'll make a quick round from our panel with a question and maybe also the request for a focused answer around the question, as business leaders, as companies see the Brics, and I had concluded my short presentation with 5 ideas, but from your experience, what would be success factors in the BRICS, expanded BRICS for companies, what could be potential pitfalls? And maybe let me start with you, Trudi. What would you see as key success factors and potential pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of success factors, really, it often boils down to the same things in business across different regional blocks. You want to invest in an area where you're going to get a reasonable return, and where you are you have the capacity to reinvest to grow that business, or to take your money out. And it sounds very straightforward, right? But we know that often in South-South investment, all of those things are very difficult. Macroeconomic conditions often make it very challenging to realize the returns that you expect in terms of sudden changes. I think what is clear with the BRICS countries is that many of them are high-growth economies. So the macroeconomic picture from that perspective is relatively stable. Of course, with expansion, there are countries that bring different kind of complications to that clear macroeconomic picture. I think similarly in the ability to reinvest or take your proceeds out, foreign exchange volatility can often change that picture, and also just capital mobility, capital restrictions sometimes make it difficult for companies to take money out. But once again, I think with most of the BRICS countries, in terms of their capital markets regulation, capital controls, those are not necessarily immediate challenges. But saying this against the context of, for instance, what's happening in Russia, certainly points to what a business would have to really think about in terms of making that business story clear from entry to exit of those profits. I think in general, economic diplomacy is needed even within BRICS countries. It's not that, because we're all similar emerging markets economies, it's all hunky-dory. There are often issues you would see at the WTO. Sometimes we have trade disputes. Sometimes even amongst ourselves, we have questions around logistics, around visas even. So I think from a business perspective, one will have to be very clear, not just a geopolitical muscle, but that economic diplomacy muscle, and which requires a bit more cooperation with your own host government when things become tricky from that perspective. But I would say that certainly when I look at South Africa's experience, corporate experience, initially after the fall of apartheid, there was a move towards the West, given that the business class was most familiar with that. But over time, there's been this opening up. And I think the BRICS countries and the expanded BRICS configuration creates that comfort to deepen those South-South relations in a forum where it feels that issues can be resolved should they arise.
Excellent, thank you very much. Étienne, you're representing a European country in a country that is part of the expanded BRICS. Austrian companies are known for being very export-oriented as well. What do you see as key success factors or potential pitfalls? What's your advice?
Thank you very much. I would say as a main advice, don't be too greedy and be a bit cautious. There is a huge potential to make money, but there's also huge potential to then not get the money out of the country you are making your business. So at least stay out of Russia. So we as Austrian companies have made this experience very hard to get out of the Russian market. So whoever is thinking now of entering the Russian market, don't do it as a Western company. Don't forget that there is something like the extraterritorial application of US sanctions. No Western company can ever afford to be subject to Western and in particular US sanctions, so keep that in mind. Keep in mind that relations will probably rather be more antagonistic between BRICS countries and the US, the West in general. So you don't want to be caught in between that thing. And honestly speaking, invest in good in-house legal departments and in-house public affairs departments, I'm not speaking from my profession, hire good former diplomats who are well connected, who may tell you, yeah, maybe you can make money, but maybe you will also then no longer be received by a senator on Capitol Hill. So must really be careful of not losing access to other markets then as well. So it's always a balancing act. If I can give one advice of where you can make money, it probably would be projects that unite the West and the Brics, be it on climate change, like the UE hosted COP28, we will have COP30 in Brazil. So climate change related projects are less antagonistic and really leading potentially more to success. IMEC could be a huge game changer as well, where infrastructure-wise you can invest with less geopolitical risks and the potential to really make good money with IMEC. And if you want to think about a headquarter for such operations, a regional headquarter, you might really think about this region here, about the UAE, about the Gulf. They are well positioned to potentially serve as a bridge between the East, between China, India, and the West. So that would be my advice.
Very interesting. I think I like also the point about what we describe as building the geopolitical muscle of companies, being able to navigate a new reality, given that the world is not flat anymore, as some people thought in the 1990s and 2000. Constanza, you're representing hundreds of Brazilian companies acting in Brazil, but also across. What's your 1-2 minute view on key success factors and pitfalls?
Well, I think we need to consider that there are three dimensions. Internally, the company, the one of the country that Trudi was saying, and probably if we look into this geopolitical and geoeconomic muscle that you were saying, in terms of key success, first I would say understanding multipolarity and non-alignment. So recognize the BRICS' role in a multipolar world and the varied geopolitical stances of its members. Second one, navigating internal dynamics. So companies need to be mindful of tensions within the bloc, and such as diverging agendas among members, knowing about that. And third, in terms of key success factors, engaging in sustainable and diversified strategies. So companies need, as far as it's possible, to diversify investment across sectors and geographies to mitigate risk. And in terms of pitfalls to avoid three, geopolitical divisions, companies also need to be cautious about the fragmentation within BRICS due to competing national interests. Third, technological divergence. Companies need to have a plan for compatibility challenges in a fragmented technological landscape within the BRICS. And last but not least, the erosion of cohesiveness. So companies need to account of the risk posed by BRICS expansion. It's in its internal unity. We will have to see how this goes in terms of the future and whether this can be a challenge for companies' operations. So I will sum up with those 6.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, what would be your perspective, a couple of minutes on, maybe also from a Chinese perspective, key success factors and pitfalls?
First of all, I guess the one factor is we should take one strategy for one country, because all these BRICS have been very diversified in terms of different development strategy, different social system. You cannot use one strategy for all of our BRIC countries. For example, I guess 2 or 3 weeks, I, with some Chinese businessmen, met some businessmen in South Africa. We asked them, what do you want? In my mind, Chinese can provide the EV. They said, no, we don't want an EV now, maybe in 5 years, because we don't have kind of infrastructure for EV. What we want is we may look at some alternate facility in China. For example, like a blast furnace, you can dismantle it, remove the part to our country, which reminded me, actually, back 20, 30 years ago, China did the same thing. We dismantle some alternate the facility in US, in Japan, then move their, the parts back to China, then assemble it. That's the first factor. Second factor, we should deeply study the business environment, law and regulation continuously, not only before invest, also after invest in the operation. For example, like currently the US government have a lot of restriction on investment, particularly in China. I guess a couple of days ago, one biochemical US company come to my office, ask me what they're supposed to do. I say, yes, in some cases now China in the very difficult position, but you look deeply on your specific industry, you do have some potential, because at least until now, biochemical industry is not in the small yard of the US government. Also in China, the middle class grow up, the population started aging. Also, Chinese government has started build lots of hospitals. That's great needs for your specific industry. The second factor is should fully use and trust local talents and experts. In this case, I guess US multiple companies did very well, particularly in China. Not like in some countries, they prefer use their own citizenship, their citizen. Not like US companies, they just want to use every talent, even local people. So-called pitfall, I guess something should be avoided. First of all, decision-making sometimes is too much concentrated in headquarters. That's something should be avoided. Secondly, should not simply copy experience in advanced countries, even it was successful in advanced countries or even in other developing countries, should do something deeply fit to specific countries. That's my...
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, we'll open up for questions in the audience. So the first hand was here. Yes, please, gentleman here in the middle, and I see a few others. Yes, coming. Please just introduce yourself quickly, and short questions, short answers.
Thank you. Hiro Akita from Tokyo, Nikkei. So 2 quick questions. One is, what is a glue to unite the BRICS together? It sounds like glue is to get richer together, so economic prosper. But eventually, do you think that the BRICS will also unite politically to push forward its own rule making? That is the one question. And second question is journalistic question. If Mr. Trump changed his mind and think that, oh, I want to also join the BRICS, so let us participate in BRICS. We can do business together. Let's prosper together. What do you think will be the best reaction from BRICS?
Okay, good. Very quick question. Constanza, do you want to?
Yeah.
But we need to be on time, so quick question, answer, please.
As I say, the purpose for BRICS, I guess, based on their need for their quick growth, also, in some sense, express their unhappiness to existing international institutions, because they don't feel they are be treated equally. I guess, on the other hand, that's maybe the weakness of BRICS, because they don't have a very solid base on, just like G7 on the ideology. That's maybe is a weakness. Yeah. For your second question, I don't think it will happen.
Good. Next question. Yes.
Yes. Good afternoon, Jean-Michel Severino, Ferdi. I have actually a follow-up question. At the beginning of the BRICS movement, there was a clarity, even with all the problems and the hiccups that Mrs. Makhaya mentioned about the nature of the project, which was both political and economic. Now, what is striking, and very much around middle-income countries, emerging economies. Now, what has happened very recently is the extension of the Brics to Saudi Arabia on the one hand, but also Ethiopia on the other hand. And therefore, the project is some kind of blurred. Where is it going? My predecessor asked whether US would join, but my question would be, Ben, is South Sudan next to join?
Okay.
What's the project?
Yeah, very good question. Maybe, Trudi, do you want to quickly answer?
Yeah, so I mean, the Brics itself has put, I don't know if it's public, but they do have a framework that they've worked on in terms of thinking about how to include new countries and how to deal with expansion. I think the first set of expansion was a bit less methodical, but I think going forward we should expect to see a bit more structure to it. But having said that, I mean, I think the glue, you know, somebody gave the example of G7 and G20. Both were pretty much problem-solving exercises in terms of challenges of the moment. So I don't think we should criticize Brics for being also problem-solving for what those countries see as challenges of the moment. And I think in terms of glue, to the extent that constructive and new institutions can be built that are not, to put it crudely, about grievances, but actually about really advancing certain ideas. I think that will be the ultimate test. And as I mentioned earlier, I think an institution like the New Development Bank gives a hint of what's possible in terms of actually just building something new, which isn't necessarily about complaints with the established order.
Very good. Last question, yes, the lady here on the second row.
Yeah, hello. I am Marie-Roger Biloa. My question is linked to the first one, which was raised, and it is about the ambition of the Brics. When we see the numbers, the figures, you introduced to us with the trade, what they represent of the global economy, and all this, it sounds very powerful, but you don't feel the ambition to challenge the world order, which some people believed the Brics is all about. And I wonder if I'm right in assessing that. Why is the question of the currency, the common currency, did not really appear there? Yeah, there's a bank, but there's no. I didn't hear you speaking about that currency. So my question is, do the Brics really want to be an alternative organization to, I don't know, to what we call the old world order? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Constanza, please.
I think it's a very good question, and in terms, and I knew it would come while the private sector is not talking about this topic within the Brics. And I think that the way to see it is that probably they haven't delivered so far in terms of the bloc, and I think this needs to be recognized. But at the same time, we need to, sort of Trudi was saying, give the possibility of countries that have a purpose to be an alternative and to cooperate. We don't need to demand more in terms of glue. I think the glue has changed over the past year for this group. We'll have to see whether it's still glue in the coming years with more members. And I think here there are two comments. In terms of the membership, there are some countries within the bloc that have different perspectives on costs, for instance, Brazil. And for instance, one of the priorities would be about how to establish the new membership of the group. And in terms of the currency, I think this is a topic for a long-term perspective. I think it's very legitimate to look for ways to reduce costs of transactions. But from the private sector perspective, it's not something that would happen from one day to the other. It's relevant to discuss, but there are many other priorities before that.
Yeah, very good. I think we are out of time, so sorry. Or if you have 10 seconds, please.
Okay, answer your question. The challenging depends how you define it. In terms of NDB, that's the first international organization initiated by developing countries. Yeah. In that sense, you may challenge it, but doesn't mean you want to turn down existing international institutions. as I said yesterday, they made some contribution. They play important role to keep world peacefully in 80 years, past 80 years. That's something positive. We don't want to turn down all existing international economic order.
Yeah. So we started with the discussion of saying, is it a geo-economic experiment? I think it's much more than this. It's a real reality for the world of business. And I think it's great that we have the possibility here to bring that together. Aussi un grand merci à la World Policy Conference de mettre le monde du business et le monde politique ensemble. So many thanks for your attention and a great thank you to this panel. Thank you.